So again, we're using PJI CARs to elaborate on the CARs concept. When we do our standard hip CAR, we're always talking about isolating femur inside pelvis and spine. But for PJI CARs, we can alter the orientation of the standing leg at the hip, the knee, or the pelvis. And so what do I mean by that? So if we're doing our standard hip CAR in, say, this position, my leg is just neutral. I'm giving no thought to how straight or bent my knee is, and I'm giving no thought to anterior or posterior pelvic tilt. So if we want to add like layers of complexity to our CARs, we can adjust other constraints to it so that we're challenging our body in a different manner, right? Different spatial awareness. So what we're going to do is go over hip CARs first with the standing leg fully externally rotated. So you're going to have to like pivot yourself full external rotation. You're going to lock the knee until the glute is contracted. I want you going through the whole hip CAR sequence, but not letting the knee bend, not letting the pelvis come out of extension and external rotation, and just feeling what range this hip has with these constraints in mind. Let me demonstrate on him first, and then I'm gonna have you go next. So step over this way, Rachel. Johan, let's get you holding on to the table right here. So standing leg is gonna be fully externally rotated. I'm gonna ask you to keep your knees straight for right now so you can feel full hip extension. The entire time you're doing this, I want you feeling the glute contracted on the standing leg, and then this is gonna be your second priority. If this is your primary focus, you're gonna lose the hip extension on this side. So the knee is straight, the hip's extended. Go ahead and begin the sequence with the right hip. So you're just gonna find external rotation. Try, pick it up, pick it up, pick it up. Flex your hip, flex your hip, flex your hip. Lift the knee up, you can do it. You can do it, right there, yeah. It'll take you a second. I was like, is it coming or what? Straight knee, hip extension, right there. Go ahead and begin abducting. You're maintaining hip ER external rotation here. The knee is straight, lock this knee, watch your spine. And again, with these constraints in mind, we're looking to see how much movement we get through his right femur. And then same thing, internal rotation, extension. Knee is straight, hip extended, extend the right hip now. Find the glute contraction. abduct, but at no point are we coming out of external rotation and we're staying in that end range. And then full ER all the way around. Give me another one, and then we'll do the other leg. Straight knee, maintain external rotation, keep the ribs down, the spine isn't moving. Don't flare, don't flare, don't flare. Bend the knee a little bit more. Extend the hip a little bit more. Internally rotate a little bit more. Straighten the left knee, straighten the left knee, extend the left hip. Beautiful, reverse, kick back to me. Fine abduction. Don't lose me here. Don't lose me here. And then full external rotation. Do you feel how that right hip has different constraints when the opposing leg is locked into one position?
Very good.
Make sense? I want you to come up and I'm gonna demonstrate internal rotation, and then you guys are gonna practice. So you're gonna do the exact same thing. Go ahead and hold on to the table. Now we're gonna have the standing leg fully internally rotated with the knee straight.
Okay.
That's your primary focus.
Okay.
Whatever this hip can do with these constraints in mind is the only thing we're going for, right? Like it's gonna feel like different workspace. You're so used to and you're patternized to what the standard hip CAR feels like that the standing legs constraints get altered because you're trying to match what you associate the hip CAR as. The hip CAR we always do is not anything special. It's just the default we go to. Different constraints create different spatial awareness, different afferents, kinesthetic awareness. So internal rotation at the hip, squeeze the butt here. Go ahead and begin the sequence in this right leg. It's very awkward. Keep that internally rotated. And then again, keep ribs down. We're not extending up the spine. Good, internal rotation, beautiful. Don't lose the knee, keep that internally rotated. Yep, extend now. And you don't have to do this at end range either, right? It could be at mid-range external rotation, it could be mid-range internal rotation. I'm having her do it and you do it at absolute end range in an effort to like show you, wow, how different is that? But that doesn't mean you should do it that way per se, it's just a different option. Does that make sense? Yeah? Go again for me. So again, we have the whole femur on the standing leg internally rotated relative to the pelvis. The spine isn't moving. And we're going through whatever range of motion you have there with the left hip constrained the way we're labeling it. Hip extension, watch the ribs. Don't move the pelvis at all. Give me a little bit more external rotation. Does that make sense? So just different dynamics. And something that's worth kind of thinking about is when I deadlift, I have a particularly hard time at the top feeling my glutes when my hips externally rotate on the left side. So when I do my hip car in that position, because I struggle at hip extension, external rotation, when I do the hip car with this left leg, I can feel this left leg wanting to dump out of external rotation a lot because that is the range that I have a hard time in when I'm loading it at the top of a deadlift. So again, we're trying to just offer more specificity to whatever external training you're doing, and understanding how the internal pieces apply to the external task can help you kind of unlayer it a little bit more. How about you both practice hip ER, hip IR, keeping the knee completely locked. I'm gonna go to both of you and keep an eye on you and make sure that, let's say you're doing it with external rotation in mind, that you're not doing this with the standing leg. Okay, you're extending the hip much more if the standing knee is locked out. It's gonna matter quite a bit. Then we're gonna talk about changing pelvic orientation. So standing leg, full external rotation, the knee is locked, so you have terminal knee extension. What might help is initially planting the leg and finding full external rotation. So think full ER right here. Straighten the knee. Straighten this knee more, extend the hip more. That's all you got. Okay, so we're exposing how little external rotation we have in hip extension. Resume, do whatever you can do with that left leg. Go through the sequence. I mean, talk about spatial awareness, not knowing how to move our hip capsule with different constraints in mind. And so the same pieces are being applied here. Ribs down, we're not extending at the spine. We're still trying to find the right hip tissue at each corner. You're gonna have less workspace with these constraints in mind. So again, you're not trying to match the feeling we get on the standard hip car. Nice, nice, nice. Come back up again. So straight knee, fully extended. We feel the glute on the left side contracting. Maintain external rotation. Good, good, good. Keep this knee straight, keep this knee straight. Keep the butt squeezed. Good, good. Whatever workspace you have here, man, you have. Don't force it. Again, you're just trying to get familiar with this stuff. Bring it out as far as you can. Nice, nice. More external, more external, more external. Good. You could tell he struggles to maintain that level of external rotation. In a perfect world, his foot would be completely perpendicular with his torso, right? He's only to about here. I would want him all the way out if he had it. Let's flip you around. Try the other hip. That's hard for you, isn't it? So now think of it like if we're going into internal training for you, right? You have a deficit in external rotation extension. You could do your global hip car, fine, but doesn't it make sense to do a variation of a hip car with these constraints if that's the way you're gonna tackle your internal training? If you're doing a lot of hip extension, external rotation work, the hip car should reflect that. Doesn't mean that's the only hip car you're doing, but it's another way to kind of prime it before you get into your other internal training. So same thing, yep, you initiate, pivot the knee is fixed, fully externally rotate, lock that foot down. Find hip extension, squeeze the standing glute, and then begin the sequence. All the way through and just feel where your workspace is with those constraints. And then we're gonna do internal rotation and compare the two and kind of get an idea of how they differ. Keep that locked. Yep. Yep, no hiking here, ribs down, man. Yep, wherever you got it, it's okay. More isn't inherently better. And for those watching the video, we can see this leg isn't totally perpendicular with his torso. He's kind of almost at end range, but we don't have enough to be fully at the end of external extension. And so this positioning is kind of exposing that deficit he struggles with. Give me one or two more, and then we'll move on and switch. Let's do the same thing. Go into internal rotation, run through a couple rounds of internally rotated cars, feeling the constraints with that. Same concept, standing leg is planted, fully internally rotate wherever that is. The knee is straight, we try to contract glute. Now begin the sequence with the standing leg, and wherever that workspace is, it is. You might feel like you're getting less flexion, more extension. You might feel like you're getting more or less abduction. The rotation might feel different with the pelvis in a different orientation as well. So again, the same sequence, both the standing leg and internal rotation. You got a little bit more ER here, a little bit more ER. Let's get another 2 on this leg and then we're gonna switch. So full external rotation. Bring it all the way around, the ribs don't flare, the spine's not rotating, the knee is staying straight, you're finding full internal rotation here. Park the knee under you. Reverse, find full hip extension. It's gonna feel different than the standing hip car, the standard one. And then externally rotate. Let's get one more there, and then we'll give you a minute and give you some different variables to tinker with. So we just did standing hip cars and hip extension. You can do hip cars side lying and on all fours like a quadruped to like bias different planes, right? So like if we're doing standing, it's flexion bias. If you're on all fours, it's hip extension bias, right? And if you're laying on your side, it's abduction bias, right? Based on the angle of, or the positioning against gravity. We're gonna have you do it in hip flexion, but you can play around with anterior or posterior pelvic tilt. I don't really care if you're like this. I don't care if you're like this. But I have us in this position rather than quadruped, because if I'm in quadruped, my knee is gonna hit the ground and it's gonna limit how much rotation we can actually get. It's a lot more linear movement, not rotational movement. So we're gonna have you in hip flexion, leaned over. I wanna see like almost 90 degrees. You're gonna get a hamstring stretch. Ribs down, same concept. With the constraints in mind, that my pelvis is anteriorly tilted, what range do I have in hip flexion with the standing leg in anterior pelvic tilt as well? I could do posterior pelvic tilt. And my back is now rounded. My workspace is different. The hip extension is almost non-existent. If I go into anterior pelvic tilt, I get a lot more hip extension. So now we're playing around with this and this, along with being in hip flexion rather than hip extension. So I like the idea of each of you being on each side of the box and then tinkering with it, and then we'll kind of explore the space. Anterior pelvic tilt. Straighten the standing leg. Now with these constraints in mind, go ahead and begin doing the hip car on the right side. More anterior pelvic tilt. And again, wherever your workspace is, your workspace is. If you feel the spine and the pelvis wanting to dump, you're exceeding the range with the pre-established constraints I'm giving you. And so if we're doing this with spine extension and anterior pelvic tilt and hip flexion, I shouldn't see the lumbar spine rounding, and I shouldn't see any posterior pelvic tilt. So maintain anterior pelvic tilt, the same sequence. External rotation, you're going where you can go. Internal rotation, watch the spine into hip extension. Reverse, hip extension. Feel the glute contract, spine doesn't move. Externally rotate, more external, more external, more external. Don't let the pelvis move. And give me one more there. Anterior pelvic tilt, more anterior tilt. Don't lose me here, don't lose me here. Yep, yep, bring the leg up, 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 good. Reverse, hip extension. Find the glute. Beautiful, externally rotate, more ER from here. Watch the spine, and relax it. Let's see what we got here. Bend this knee a little bit more. Good. Anterior pelvic tilt more. Flex at your hip more. Push this back some. That. Now head down. Good. Now resume. So it's just a hip flexion bias car rather than being in hip extension. You could do it with posterior or anterior tilt. There isn't one way to do this. So now try doing it with posterior tilt. You can do it with knee bent as well on the standing leg. So you have posterior tilt right here, right? You're tucking your tail. Now feel the workspace that this hip has in posterior pelvic tilt, wherever that is. I don't care what it looks like. I care about what it feels like. Are you able to connect with the femur moving independently of a posteriorly tilted pelvis while we're in hip flexion rather than hip extension? Yep, yep, yep. Good, standing leg stay straight. Find hip extension, glute. You're still in posterior tilt though. Keep tucking the tail, ribs down, core tight, spine's flexed. More external rotation. External, external. Yep, yep, yep. Ankle up, ankle up. Keep going, man. Keep going, man. Give me one more there. Nice. Push into me, push into me. Yep. Good, tuck the tail, tuck the tail. That right there. You see how you came out of that a little bit? I want you to do the same thing.
Yeah, can you do it with me?
So do the other leg, do the other leg. So posterior tilt. So now we feel the lumbar spine flexed with the pelvis tucked.
So it's okay if it's flexed, it doesn't have
Totally, totally, totally. If getting posterior tilt, tucking the tail, and you need to flex the lumbar spine, do that, that's fine. But then again, whatever this hip feels and looks is what it is, right? I don't want you accommodating and patternizing yourself to the way we normally do the hip car. So this is locked. Keep pushing this into me. More flexion, more posterior tilt. If you guys are doing this with posterior tilt to the pelvis, hip extension in particular is gonna feel different. Nice. Does that kind of make sense? And this would be similar to a quadruped hip car, but you have a little bit more autonomy over the pelvic position. You have more workspace because the knees are able to not hit the ground. The knee's able to move freely, and you're able to get more rotational focus. Full ER, full ER, full ER, but keep the pelvic tilt. Do you have questions on that? You're sweating a lot.
Yeah.
But and again, it's just different variation. That's all it is. It's not better or worse, no different. But if we wanted to train yourself in hip flexion to have a little bit more bias towards that, if you want to add more constraints, if someone has a very hard time moving their pelvis, then it makes sense to do hip cars with different pelvic orientations, right? Create better afferents, reconnect neural pathways for those individuals. And that'll prime tissue so that when you externally train, you get a little bit more bang for your buck out of it. And so again, just accommodating yourself to the standard hip car is a problem in itself. It's no different than accommodating to any other external task-based exercise. The car is the anti-patternization tool, and PJI CARs allow you to not patternize yourself. That's, I think, the end game on it. So we talked about doing the hip car with external and internal rotation bias, right? Standing leg externally rotated, standing leg internally rotated. What I want you guys to do now is we're gonna go back to the neutral position and restart with the basic hip car, but this time I want your pelvis hiked, okay? So think like you're doing a hip hike here, hip hike, pelvic hike. So you're gonna do your hip car with the hip hiked, maintain that hip hiked position, and again, right, that's all the abduction I have. As soon as I go up into full extension, look how much more abduction I have. I hike, look where my leg goes to. I hike up, look how much further my leg can go. So visually, it looks different, and internally, it feels different. Normally, this leg is posteriorly tilted, not hiked at all. So you're gonna hike it, and feel whatever workspace you have. The rotation and abduction is gonna be different. You're gonna feel yourself pushing forward. You're not letting yourself. We're giving you preset constraints. Make sense? Do you wanna try? Or do you wanna watch them first? Try, come on.
Let's go, bro.
Do you know how to hike your hip? Yeah, exactly, right there. So you feel the stretch in the hip hike, right? So what you're doing right now is the standing legs going into the hip hike.
Wait, so am I feeling the joint like pop out?
Yes,
okay.
That's what you're going for. So you feel like almost like a stretch sensation.
Yeah.
Maintain that stretch sensation. So the whole time your job is to keep that positioning. And now I want you to go through the standard hip car sequence that we would normally do, but do not let this hip come out of the hip hike. So you still have that stretch sensation in the right hip.
Yeah.
And now stay externally rotated. Now bring your leg out. But don't lose that hip hike. Don't lose the hip hike. You see where you end. That's all you got. That's fine. Start internally rotating. Yep. Don't lose the hip hike. Keep going. Yep. You see how hard that is?
Yeah.
And that's okay. That's the point. We're giving you constraints, and you're learning to move this hip independently of this one, and the pelvis is in a preset orientation. So keep internally rotating. Keep internally rotating. Keep internally rotating. Don't lose the hip hike. Keep going. Keep hiking that. Drop it more. Yep. And then all the way into hip extension to about right here-ish. Park your knee under you more. Right there. Now reverse. Bring your knee out to me. You feel the butt squeeze right here.
Yeah.
Keep that hiked though. Don't lose me. Right there. Now externally rotate. Start bringing ankle in, ankle in, ankle in. A little bit more. Think ankle up as high as you can. Yes, right there. All the way around. And you could feel yourself with that standing hip wanting to come up, And again, it's about body control, spatial awareness, kinesthetic awareness, and we're just elaborating on the concept of CARs by creating different base positions. Normally the standing leg is like this. Previous to this, we did the leg like this. We did the leg internally rotated. You just did it with the pelvis height. It's just different variations within hip CARs is what we're doing basically. You guys have questions on that? You wanna practice? Let's practice. You have a stretch on this hip. Can you sink deeper into that? A little bit more, a little bit more, right there. You see how you found a little bit more of a stretch? So don't just assume right out the gate that's all the stretch you have. Yeah. Think first, how deep into that can I get? Then we start moving the right leg. And wherever you can move it, but with these constraints. Keep internally rotating, yep. Bend the knee a little bit more, yep. And you're just gonna keep going like this. Don't lose the stretch, sink into it more. That, right there. Now keep that stretch, resume, back to the starting position. So AB duct, you're going out as far as you can. We feel the glute contract. Now begin externally rotating. Good, keep going, keep going. Don't lose that pelvic hike though. Don't lose the pelvic hike. Get that hip hike a little bit more, sink into it right there. Back all the way to the starting position. So you see how I'm setting you in this hip hike, and whatever this hip can do while you're in that position, that's it. Same thing, back around. So find that stretch. Tired, right? It's hard, it's very hard. And if you have a hard time with the hip hike in general, then like this is a good way for you to train it and become more spatially aware of that positioning, that orientation. So we have the hip hike, right? You're thinking this hip is elevating, this hip is dropping. Yep, a bigger stretch there. And now bring the right leg around, but don't lose the left leg's orientation. Wherever it is, it is. Yes. 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 Keep going, you got it. Maintain that hike, maintain that hike. Yep. We still have a stretch sensation on that left hip. Maintain that stretch sensation. As long as that sensation's there, this hip's along for the ride. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Sink into it more. Sink into it more. More hip extension. Under you. Yep. Under you. Watch your ribs. Watch your ribs. Now reverse. Bring your leg out to me. Yep. You feel the glute. Now externally rotate. Keep that hike. Don't lose me. Beautiful. More ER here. Good. Bring it up. Bring it up. Bring it up. Bring it up. Nice. Very hard. You can see where one leg starts kind of jumping into it compared to the other. Yeah. And I'm trying to get you to decouple them, kind of learn to pull them apart.
So what does it mean
that's hard? That if like, so Johan here, when we were doing the hip car, we did his standing leg in external rotation. He struggles with external rotation and hip extension. Yeah. So when I put him in that position, like right now his leg is neutral, right? Fairly neutral. When I pulled him here, he sucked there. He couldn't maintain that positioning. It was super uncomfortable. His lack of awareness of movement in that position. So his neurology there stinks. He lacks range of motion there. We exposed a functional deficit by doing a car with different orientation in mind. So we're just altering body positioning. We altered one hip's position, we altered your pelvis position, we can bend your knee, we can straighten your knee. We're just altering the relationship between joints in an effort to like create a better internal grid of your body. And if you feel like you're like kind of lost in the hip hike, or you feel like you're kind of lost in the rotation of the hip, I'm trying to develop that internal awareness through different variations of CARs, and that's all it is. So from here, initially, just like we found, you had a hard time finding it initially. He finds the stretch. Once that stretch is found, he locks that in. It's in stone, it doesn't move. This leg begins moving. And as soon as he lost this, he exceeded the range on the right hip with the constraint I gave him. It's an artificial constraint in order to challenge spatial awareness in a different relation to one another. The pelvis, the hip, the knee, the spine, all have a job to do, and we're altering their positions to challenge them in a different environment. And at no point did he lose that. His first tendency would be to probably come up and bend at the knee. The closest two joints are trying to come out of the end range. They look for the path of least resistance. That's most resistance. It's very awkward. It's meant to be awkward. We're trying to improve the function of the hip and the pelvis together.